December 3rd, 1985. Coral Gables, Florida. Margaret Castellanos had exactly 72 hours to live. She just didn't know it yet. Maggie finished balancing the books at Esperanza Medical Center at 6:47 p.m. The $3.2 million she'd moved from Griselda Blanco's offshore accounts showed as a routine insurance adjustment. Clean, untraceable. Her granddaughter's chemotherapy would start Monday morning. What Maggie didn't know was that Griselda Blanco never forgot a face or a debt, and the woman who'd been watching Maggie's quiet life for 15 years had just made her move. By Thursday morning, 3 bodies would be found in Biscayne Bay. By Friday, Maggie would disappear. And by Saturday, Miami would learn that sometimes a grandmother's love is more dangerous than a cartel queen's rage. The night that proved blood runs deeper than betrayal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of Esperanza Medical Center hummed their familiar tune as Maggie locked her desk drawer for what she believed would be the last time. Her arthritis complained when she twisted the key, but 15 years of hiding had taught her that pain was just another form of patience. She slipped the transfer confirmations into her purse, innocent-looking papers that represented Sophia's lifeline. $3.2 million, rerouted through 17 shell companies she'd memorized like prayer. The money would appear legitimate by morning. Just another insurance payout in a system drowning in paperwork. Maggie's Toyota Camry coughed to life in the employee parking lot. She'd chosen the car for its invisibility, beige paint, dented bumper, the kind of vehicle that disappeared in traffic. For 15 years, invisibility had been her religion. The drive home to her modest duplex on Miracle Mile took 12 minutes. She knew because she'd timed it exactly 2,847 times. Routine was armor, predictability was protection. Margaret Castellanos, church lady and cancer survivor, lived a life measured in careful moments. But tonight, something felt different. The streetlight outside her house flickered erratically, casting nervous shadows across her front yard. Mrs. Chen's dog next door, usually a champion barker, was silent. Even the Cuban cafe on the corner had closed early, its neon sign dark for the first time in memory. Maggie's fingers trembled as she fumbled with her house keys. Age, she told herself. Just age and stress and the weight of what she'd done. Sophia needed that treatment. The doctors had been clear without immediate chemotherapy, her 17-year-old granddaughter had weeks, not months. Inside, the house felt hollow. The photos lining the hallway, Sophia's school pictures, church picnics, family barbecues, seemed to watch her with knowing eyes. In the kitchen, flour still dusted the counter from yesterday's batch of oatmeal cookies for the church bake sale. The normalcy felt like a costume that no longer fit. She poured herself 3 fingers of rum, a habit from the old days that crept back during times of stress. The liquid burned, but it also remembered. It remembered a different woman with a different name who'd once made numbers dance for very dangerous people. The phone rang. Maggie's hand froze halfway to the glass. At 7:23 p.m. on a Tuesday night, her phone never rang. Sophia was at the hospital. Father Rodriguez was preparing for evening mass. The few friends she'd cultivated in her careful life would be watching Wheel of Fortune. Ring, ring, ring. Her answering machine clicked on. "Hi, you've reached Margaret. Please leave a message, and I'll get right back to you." Her voice sounded older on the recording, weathered by years of practiced meekness. Silence stretched across the line. Then, slowly, deliberately, someone began to laugh. It wasn't a happy sound. It was the laugh of a woman who'd found something she'd been looking for. The laugh carried an accent, Colombian, maybe Cuban, and underneath it, the patient satisfaction of a predator who'd finally cornered her prey. The line went dead. Maggie's rum glass shattered against the kitchen floor. Her hands shook as she reached for the phone, dialing Sophia's hospital room with muscle memory. "Oncology ward, this is Maria. This is Margaret Castellanos. I need to speak with my granddaughter, Sofia Restrepo." A pause, paper shuffling. "Ma'am, Sophia was discharged about an hour ago." Her aunt picked her up. The kitchen tilted. Maggie gripped the counter until her knuckles went white. "What aunt? Sophia doesn't have an aunt." "I'm sorry, ma'am. The woman had all the proper documentation. Sophia seemed to know her. They left together willingly. The phone slipped from Maggie's fingers, clattering across the linoleum. 15 years of careful planning, of measured breaths and practiced prayers, crumbled in an instant. The life she'd built, Margaret the bookkeeper, Margaret the widow, Margaret the harmless church lady, had been a performance, and someone had been watching from the audience all along. She stumbled to her bedroom, hands shaking as she pulled the loose floorboard near her closet. Hidden beneath lay items from her previous life, a passport with a different name, $20,000 in cash, and a .38 revolver she'd hoped never to touch again. The gun felt heavier than she remembered. Or maybe her hands had grown weaker with age and deception. Outside, a car engine purred to life. Through her bedroom curtains, she watched a black Mercedes creep past her house like a shark in shallow water. The driver was a woman with silver hair and predator's eyes who nodded once, a greeting between old acquaintances, before disappearing into the Miami night. Maggie closed her eyes and let 15 years of careful breathing fall away. When she opened them again, something harder looked back from the mirror across the room. Margaret Castellanos might bake cookies and teach Sunday school, but Elena Vasquez had once laundered money for the most dangerous woman in Miami. And Elena Vasquez knew exactly who had Sophia. The hunt had begun. Where are you following along from tonight? Drop a comment below. I love connecting with readers worldwide. And if this story has hooked you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's chapter reveals a secret that changes everything we thought we knew about Maggie's past. The .38 felt like holding a piece of her own skeleton. Familiar weight, deadly purpose, cold metal that remembered the warmth of her palm from another lifetime. Maggie, no, Elena, set the gun on her nightstand and stared at the woman in the mirror. 15 years had carved lines around her eyes, softened her jawline, painted gray through the black hair she'd once worn like armor. But underneath the careful camouflage of suburban widowhood, the predator's bones remained intact. She moved through her house like a ghost visiting its own haunting. Each room told the story of Margaret Castellanos, the kitchen where she'd baked hundreds of cookies for church functions, flour permanently embedded in the wooden cutting board's grain. The living room where she'd hosted book club meetings, discussing romance novels while carefully avoiding anything with violence. The spare bedroom she'd converted into Sophia's sanctuary during chemo treatments. Walls painted soft yellow because her granddaughter said it felt like sunshine. Sophia. The name was a prayer and a curse rolled into one syllable. Elena sank into Sophia's reading chair, a threadbare recliner they'd rescued from a garage sale 3 years ago. The cushions still held the impression of Sophia's slight frame, still carried the faint scent of the coconut shampoo she favored. On the nightstand, a half-finished crossword puzzle lay abandoned. 17 across, Spanish for hope. 8 letters, Esperanza. Sophia had written the word in her careful cursive, the same handwriting she'd inherited from her mother. Her mother. Elena's daughter Carmen, who'd died in a car accident when Sophia was 7. Carmen, who'd never known her mother's real name, who'd believed Margaret Castellanos was just a quiet bookkeeper starting over after her husband's death. Carmen, who'd trusted her mother to raise Sophia in safety, in normalcy, in the kind of life Elena had murdered people to escape. The weight of that deception pressed against Elena's ribs like broken glass. She'd told herself the lies were protection, that distance was love in its purest form. Better for Carmen to think her mother was boring than dangerous. Better for Sophia to have a grandmother who baked cookies than one who'd once washed blood money until it sparkled clean. But someone had been watching, someone who knew that Margaret Castellanos was a carefully constructed fiction, who understood that beneath the church lady facade lived a woman who'd once been indispensable to Griselda Blanco's empire. Someone who'd waited 15 years to collect a debt Elena thought she'd paid in full. Thunder rumbled across Coral Gables, and the first drops of rain began tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. Elena recognized the sound. Miami rain had its own rhythm, different from the gentle showers that fell on her carefully maintained garden. This was tropical rain, violent and cleansing, the kind that washed the city clean while drowning its secrets deeper. She pulled out her phone, not the iPhone Margaret used for church committees and doctor's appointments, but a secure device she'd kept charged and hidden for 15 years. The screen displayed 3 missed calls from a blocked number. No messages, no demands. Just the patient persistence of someone who knew their prey would eventually come to them. Elena dialed a number she'd memorized but never used. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Marcos. It's Elena. Silence stretched across the line. She could picture Marcos in his office above the auto shop in Little Havana. Gray-haired now, probably wearing the same style of guayabera he'd favored when they'd worked together. He'd been her information broker, her early warning system, her escape route when necessary. If anyone would know what had awakened after 15 years of sleep, it would be Marcos. Elena Vasquez is dead, he said carefully. Has been for years. Someone forgot to tell them that. She moved to the window, watching rain streak down glass like tears. They have Sophia. Another pause. Keyboard clicking in the background. Your granddaughter? Mierda, Elena. I told you hiding in plain sight was dangerous. I had no choice. Carmen was pregnant, and I know the story. His voice carried the weight of old friendship and older fears. Question is, who else knows it? Because if this is about the money you took tonight, we have bigger problems than kidnapping. Elena's blood chilled. How do you know about the money? Because $3.2 million doesn't just disappear from Griselda's accounts without people noticing, especially when those accounts have been under surveillance for months. The phone slipped in Elena's suddenly sweaty palm. Surveillance by who? DEA. FBI. Take your pick. Your quiet little bookkeeping job just became the center of a federal investigation, and now your granddaughter is missing. Through the rain-streaked window, Elena watched another black Mercedes cruise past her house. This one moved slower, deliberately, like a shark that knew its prey was trapped in shallow water. The hunt had indeed begun. But Elena was beginning to understand she might not be the hunter. She was the hunted. The realization hit Elena like ice water flooding her veins. 15 years of paranoid caution, of checking shadows and memorizing exit routes, and she'd walked straight into a trap that had been 15 years in the making. Marcos, she whispered into the phone. How long have they been watching? That's the million-dollar question. Literally. More keyboard clicking. The accounts you accessed tonight, they weren't just Griselda's operational funds. They were bait. Elena's legs gave out. She collapsed into Sophia's reading chair, the familiar scent of coconut shampoo now smelling like a funeral bouquet. Bait for who? For Elena Vasquez, the ghost accountant who laundered $40 million and vanished like smoke. They've been waiting for you to surface, but I've been clean for 15 years. Margaret Castellanos doesn't even have a parking ticket. Margaret Castellanos is a paper angel. Beautiful work, by the way. I should know. I helped create her. But someone with serious resources has been peeling back layers waiting for the moment Elena would have to surface. Marcos paused. A dying granddaughter was always going to be your trigger. Thunder crashed overhead, and the lights flickered. In the strobing darkness, Elena caught glimpses of herself in Sophia's vanity mirror. Fractured images of past and present colliding. Margaret the church lady, Elena the money launderer. Both women trapped in the same aging body, both equally responsible for Sophia's disappearance. There's something else, Marcos said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The accounts you hit tonight, they're not just under federal surveillance. Someone else has been tracking them, someone with access to banking systems that shouldn't exist. What do you mean? I mean, ghost protocols. Shadow networks that mirror legitimate banking but operate completely off-grid. The kind of infrastructure that takes decades to build and costs more than most countries' GDP. Elena's mouth went dry. She knew of only one organization with that kind of reach, that level of patient, methodical planning, but it was impossible. The Medellin infrastructure had died with Pablo Escobar in 1993. Griselda's organization had scattered like roaches when the lights came on. Marcos, you're scaring me. Good. You should be scared, because whoever orchestrated this knew exactly which accounts you'd target, exactly how you'd move the money, and exactly when you'd discover Sophia was missing. This isn't revenge, Elena. This is recruitment. The word hung in the air like smoke. Elena closed her eyes, remembering the last time someone had tried to recruit her. It was 1970, and she'd been a junior accountant at a Miami bank, young and naive enough to believe that helping Cuban exiles move money was patriotic work. By the time she understood she was washing cocaine profits, she'd been too deep to surface clean. Her phone buzzed with an incoming text. Unknown number. The child is safe. For now. Bayfront Park. Midnight. Come alone. Below the message was a photograph that made Elena's world tilt sideways. Sophia sat in what appeared to be the back seat of an expensive car, very much alive and seemingly unharmed. She was reading a book, something thick and academic, with a small frown of concentration. But it wasn't Sophia's safety that stopped Elena's breathing. It was the woman visible in the car's rearview mirror. The face was older, more lined, the black hair now streaked with silver. But the eyes were unmistakable, dark, patient, and absolutely ruthless. Eyes that had watched Elena launder millions, eyes that had trusted her with the most sensitive financial operations in the Medellin cartel. Eyes that belonged to a woman who'd supposedly died in a Colombian prison 15 years ago. Griselda Blanco was alive, and she had Sophia. Elena's hands shook as she stared at the photograph. This wasn't about the $3 million. It wasn't about revenge for old betrayals or settling ancient scores. This was something far more terrifying. It was a woman who'd spent 15 years in the shadows, building something new, something bigger than what she'd lost. And she wanted Elena to help her finish it. Marcos, are you still there? Silence. She looked at her phone. Call ended. When she tried to call back, the number was disconnected. Outside, the rain hammered against her windows with tropical fury. But Elena no longer heard it. All she could hear was the echo of laughter from the answering machine, the patient satisfaction of a woman who'd spent 15 years planning this moment. Margaret Castellanos, the church lady, the widow, the harmless bookkeeper, was about to die. Not literally, but completely. Because Sophia was more than Elena's granddaughter. Sophia was Griselda's blood, too. The past hadn't just returned, it had swallowed the present whole. Elena stared at the photograph until her eyes burned, willing it to be some elaborate fake, some digital manipulation designed to break her mind. But Sophia's face was unmistakable. The slight overbite she'd inherited from her mother, the way she tucked her hair behind her left ear when concentrating, the exact tilt of her head that had been Carmen's signature gesture. And in the rearview mirror, Griselda Blanco looked exactly like a woman who'd spent 15 years planning this moment. Elena's first instinct was to run, pack the emergency bag, take the cash, disappear into the network of safe houses that Marcos had maintained across 3 states. It would take her 6 hours to reach the Georgia border, maybe 12 to be completely invisible again. She'd done it before, but Sophia's face in that photograph made running impossible. Elena could build another identity, find another small town, create another carefully boring life. She couldn't build another granddaughter. She tried calling Father Rodriguez at the church. The phone rang 12 times before switching to voicemail. Strange, Father Rodriguez never let calls go unanswered, especially during evening hours when parishioners might be struggling with crisis or conscience. Mrs. Chen next door didn't answer either. Neither did the Cuban cafe owner, or the pharmacy where Elena picked up her blood pressure medication, or the library where she volunteered on Thursday afternoons. One by one, her carefully constructed network of Margaret Castellanos connections led to empty silence. Someone had been thorough. Elena pulled out the secure phone again, scrolling through numbers she'd hoped never to use. Most belonged to people who were probably dead. The money laundering business had a brutal mortality rate, but a few might still be breathing, might still remember favors owed or debts unpaid. She tried Miguel Santos, who'd run security for 3 different cartel operations before going legitimate with a private investigation firm in Tampa. Dead number. Carlos Herrera, former CIA asset-turned-freelance intelligence broker. Number disconnected. Maria Sandoval, who'd specialized in moving human cargo across international borders. The line rang once, then a recorded message. The customer you are trying to reach is no longer available. The systematic silence was more terrifying than any threat. Someone had spent considerable time and resources cutting Elena's lifelines, isolating her from anyone who might provide assistance or information. This wasn't the work of federal agents or local police. This was private sector planning, executed with cartel-level thoroughness. She walked to her kitchen window and peered through the rain at the street beyond. The black Mercedes was still there, parked under a broken streetlight where shadows gathered like conspirators. The driver sat motionless behind the wheel, not the restless fidgeting of surveillance, but the patient stillness of a woman who knew her target had nowhere to run. Elena recognized that stillness. She'd seen it in Griselda's eyes during their last meeting in 1970, when Elena had explained why she couldn't continue working for the organization. Griselda had listened without interruption, her face expressing polite interest while her eyes calculated the cost of letting Elena walk away alive. "You understand," Griselda had said in her careful English, "that some doors, once opened, never quite close again." Elena had thought she'd closed the door by disappearing, by becoming someone else entirely, by building a life so boring that nobody would look twice. Instead, she'd simply given Griselda 15 years to plan the perfect way to open it again. The secure phone buzzed. Another text, another photograph. This one showed Sophia sitting across a restaurant table from an elderly woman whose face was partially obscured by shadow. They appeared to be having dinner. Sophia had a burger and fries, the woman something that looked like arroz con pollo. Sophia was smiling, gesturing with her hands the way she did when explaining something she found fascinating. She looked completely comfortable, unafraid, almost happy. Elena studied the image with the trained eye of someone who'd once specialized in reading situations for hidden danger. Sophia's body language showed no signs of distress or coercion. If anything, she appeared engaged in conversation, leaning forward with the eager attention she usually reserved for discussions about literature or history. The woman across from her was harder to read. Her posture suggested someone accustomed to command, but her hands were visible on the table. No restraints, no weapons, no obvious threat. She appeared to be listening to Sophia with genuine interest, occasionally nodding or asking questions. It looked like a grandmother having dinner with her granddaughter. The thought hit Elena like a physical blow. She sank into a kitchen chair, the photograph trembling in her hands as the implications unfolded like a paper flower opening in water. Sophia wasn't just Griselda's leverage, she was Griselda's family, and Elena was beginning to understand that 15 years ago, she hadn't escaped from anything at all. She'd simply been allowed to leave. The photograph slipped from Elena's nerveless fingers and fluttered to the kitchen floor like a death certificate. She stared at it lying face up on the worn linoleum, Sophia's bright smile beaming up at her from beside the refrigerator where crayon drawings from elementary school still clung with fading magnets. Sophia wasn't just Griselda's leverage, she was Griselda's family. The kitchen seemed to tilt around Elena as memories she'd buried beneath 15 years of deliberate normalcy began clawing their way to the surface. Carmen's birth in 1969. The father Carmen had never known, whose name Elena had never spoken aloud. The timing she'd convinced herself was coincidence. The genetic lottery that had given Sophia her dark eyes and quick mind. Elena's hands shook as she reached for the kitchen counter, gripping the edge until her knuckles went white. The math was simple, inevitable, devastating. Carmen born 9 months after Elena's last assignment for Griselda's organization. 9 months after the night, everything had gone wrong in ways Elena had spent decades refusing to remember. Thunder crashed overhead, and in the flickering light, Elena caught her reflection in the kitchen window, pale, haunted, finally confronting the truth she'd murdered her own conscience to avoid. She wasn't Sophia's grandmother by blood. She was Sophia's great-grandmother, and the blood that connected them ran through veins Elena had pretended didn't exist. Some doors, once opened, never quite close again. Griselda had been right, as she always was about the things that mattered. Elena hadn't walked away from the organization. She'd carried it with her in Carmen's DNA, in Sophia's brilliant mind, in the genetic legacy that no amount of suburban camouflage could erase. The secure phone buzzed again. Not a text this time, but a call from the same blocked number that had been trying to reach her all evening. Elena stared at the screen, watching it ring with the patience of inevitability. She could ignore it, let it go to voicemail, pretend for a few more minutes that Margaret Castellanos still existed. Instead, she answered. "Hello, Elena." The voice was older, rougher, marked by decades of cigarettes and careful pronunciation, but unmistakably Griselda's. "You look exactly the same." Elena's throat constricted. How long have you been watching? Since the day you moved to Coral Gables. Since you enrolled Carmen in St. Mary's Elementary. Since you started baking cookies for church functions and pretending you were someone else. A pause, filled with the sound of Elena's world crumbling. Did you really think I wouldn't recognize my own great-granddaughter? The words hit Elena like physical blows. She sank into the kitchen chair, her carefully constructed reality dissolving like sugar in rain. Carmen never knew. Sophia doesn't know. Of course they didn't know. You made sure of that. Griselda's voice carried no anger, no accusation, just the patient satisfaction of a woman whose long game had finally reached its conclusion. You gave them your lies instead of my truth. You let them believe they were ordinary. They are ordinary. Sophia is just a 17-year-old girl with leukemia who wants to study literature. She has nothing to do with your world. Griselda's laughter was soft, almost fond. My brilliant Elena, still believing your own fiction after all these years. Sophia isn't ordinary, mi amor. She's extraordinary, just like her great-grandmother. Through the kitchen window, Elena watched the black Mercedes pull away from the curb with the smooth acceleration of expensive machinery. But she could feel other eyes watching, other cars positioned in the web of surveillance that had been closing around her for longer than she'd imagined. The money, Elena whispered. You let me take the money. I practically gift-wrapped it for you. $3.2 million in accounts you knew how to access, with security protocols you helped design 15 years ago. Did you think it was coincidence that Sophia's treatment costs exactly matched what you could steal in a single night? Elena's breath caught. Sophia's medical expenses, the experimental treatment in Germany, the specialized medications, the round-the-clock care, she'd never questioned how the bills had been calculated, never wondered why the total was so precise. You've been paying for her treatment all along. Of course I have. She's my blood. Griselda's voice warmed with something that might have been genuine affection. But you needed to be the one to take the money. You needed to cross that line yourself, to remember who you really are beneath all that suburban armor. Elena closed her eyes, seeing the trap with crystalline clarity. Every choice she'd made tonight, accessing the accounts, moving the money, even discovering Sophia's disappearance, had been orchestrated with the same meticulous planning Griselda had once applied to moving $40 million through legitimate banks. What do you want? The same thing I've always wanted, Elena. Your loyalty, your skills, your complete and absolute commitment to protecting what belongs to us. A pause. Sophia belongs to us. She always has. The phone went dead, leaving Elena alone with the sound of rain and the terrible weight of understanding. Sophia wasn't a victim in Griselda's revenge. She was Griselda's inheritance. And Elena was about to pay a debt that had been compounding interest for 17 years. The silence after the call felt alive, breathing with the weight of 17 years' worth of lies finally collapsing. Elena sat motionless in her kitchen chair, staring at the phone as if it might ring again with some version of reality that didn't destroy everything she'd built. But the truth was reshaping itself around her, like water finding its level, and she could feel memories surfacing that Margaret Castellanos had never been allowed to have. The night in 1969 when everything had gone wrong, the safe house outside Miami where she'd hidden for 3 days while Griselda cleaned up the mess. The way Griselda had looked at her afterward, not with anger or disappointment, but with something that Elena had mistaken for forgiveness. She knew. Even then, Griselda had known about the pregnancy. Elena's hands trembled as she reached for the photograph on the floor. Sophia's smile looked different now. Not the innocent joy of a teenager enjoying dinner, but the satisfied expression of someone who'd finally found what she'd been looking for. The same expression Carmen used to get when she solved a particularly challenging puzzle. The same expression Elena used to get when she cracked an impossible laundering scheme. Sophia belongs to us. She always has. But there was something wrong with Griselda's certainty, something that felt like the overconfidence Elena had watched destroy lesser criminals. Griselda assumed that blood meant ownership, that genetic connection trumped the 17 years Elena had spent raising Sophia to be everything the Blanco family wasn't. A new sound penetrated the rain, footsteps on her front porch, careful and measured. Elena moved to the living room window and peered through the curtains. A young woman stood at her door, maybe 25, with Sophia's dark hair and Elena's sharp cheekbones. She wore expensive clothes and carried herself with the fluid grace of someone comfortable with violence. Elena had never seen her before, but she knew exactly who she was. "Hello, abuela." The voice carried through the door with Carmen's inflection wrapped around Griselda's cold authority. "My name is Isabella. I think it's time we met." Elena's world tilted further off its axis. Another granddaughter. One who'd been raised in Griselda's world instead of Elena's carefully constructed bubble. One who probably knew exactly which arteries to cut for maximum blood loss, who could move money through offshore accounts while discussing literature, who represented everything Elena had tried to save Sophia from becoming. "Sophia sent me," Isabella continued, her voice perfectly conversational despite the storm. "She's worried about you. She says you've been lying to her about her family her whole life, and she wants to know why." The words hit Elena like shards of broken glass. Sophia knew. Somehow, tonight, she'd learned the truth Elena had killed herself to hide. Elena opened the door. Isabella stepped inside with the fluid confidence of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. Up close, the family resemblance was impossible to deny. She had Elena's analytical eyes and Sophia's stubborn chin, but something else that made Elena's blood run cold. She had Griselda's smile. "You're beautiful," Isabella said, studying Elena's face with professional interest. "Sophia showed me pictures, but they don't capture your intelligence. I can see why Bisabuela kept you close for so long." Bisabuela, great-grandmother. The Spanish rolled off Isabella's tongue with casual familiarity, and Elena realized that this girl had grown up calling Griselda family, while Elena had spent 17 years pretending that family didn't exist. Where is Sophia? Safe, learning about her real inheritance. Isabella moved through Elena's living room like she owned it, examining the carefully normal furniture and family photographs with barely concealed amusement. She's fascinated by the financial structures you helped design. Natural talent, just like her great-grandmother. Elena felt something crack inside her chest. Sophia doesn't want any part of that world. She wants to study literature. She wants a normal life. Isabella's laugh was pure Griselda, beautiful and sharp as a blade. Normal? Abuela, Sophia moved $3 million through 6 different accounts tonight while having dinner. She restructured the routing protocols to make the transfers untraceable by federal surveillance. She did it for fun, while explaining the symbolism in Garcia Marquez. The room spun around Elena as the final piece of Griselda's trap clicked into place. Sophia hadn't been kidnapped. She'd been recruited, and Elena's attempt to save her granddaughter's life had instead delivered her directly into the world. Elena had spent 17 years helping her escape. "She chose this," Elena whispered. "Of course she did." Isabella's smile held no warmth, only the satisfied certainty of blood finally claiming its own. "Did you really think you could raise a Blanco to be ordinary forever?" But Elena heard something in Isabella's voice that Griselda had missed, the brittle confidence of someone trying to convince herself as much as her target. For all her sophistication, Isabella was still young enough to believe that genetics determined destiny. She didn't understand that Sophia had been raised by a woman who'd spent 17 years choosing love over legacy, protection over power. Griselda's arrogance was showing. She thought blood always won. She was about to learn how wrong she was. Elena straightened in her chair, and Isabella's expression flickered, just for a moment, with something that looked like uncertainty. The girl was good, but she was still performing for an audience that included herself. She needed Elena to break, to accept the inevitability of blood claiming blood. "You want to know what I think?" Elena's voice carried the quiet authority that had once made cartel bosses listen when she explained why their money trails would get them killed. "I think Griselda sent you here because she's not as confident as she pretends to be." Isabella's perfect composure slipped another degree. "Bisabuela doesn't—" "Your great-grandmother spent 17 years watching Sophia from a distance, and you know what she saw? A girl who chooses kindness over cruelty, who gives her allowance to homeless veterans outside the grocery store, who cried for 3 days when her goldfish died because she felt guilty that she hadn't cleaned its bowl often enough." Elena stood, and despite being 30 years older and 6 inches shorter, she suddenly commanded the room. That's not genetics, Isabella. That's choice. And Sophia has been making those choices her entire life. She moved $3 million tonight because she thought she was saving her grandmother's life. Elena stepped closer, watching Isabella retreat half a step before catching herself. Do you know what she told the bank representative when he questioned the transfers? She said she was paying for cancer treatment. Not leukemia, cancer. Because even while she was discovering her real family, her first instinct was to protect me from additional scrutiny. Thunder rolled overhead, and in the silence that followed, Elena could hear Isabella's careful breathing. The girl was calculating, reassessing, recognizing that the conversation had shifted in ways she hadn't anticipated. The routing protocol Sophia restructured, Elena continued, her voice softening into something more dangerous than anger. I designed those systems to be unbreakable by anyone who didn't understand their underlying philosophy. The fact that Sophia could modify them means she didn't just copy my techniques, she understood my principles. And my principles, Isabella, have never been about power. They were about protection. Isabella's voice was smaller now, less certain. Bisabuela told me, you protected money, assets, people. I protected people from themselves, from making choices they'd have to live with forever, from becoming the kind of person who could look in the mirror and see only blood instead of conscience. Elena moved to the window, watching rain streak down the glass like tears. Your great-grandmother thinks Sophia moved that money because she has Blanco instincts. But I know Sophia. She moved it because she thought she had no choice. Isabella was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her carefully cultivated accent had slipped into something younger, more vulnerable. Sophia asked about you. During dinner, she wanted to know if you were proud of her. The words hit Elena like a physical blow. She closed her eyes, seeing Sophia's face from the photograph. Not the satisfied expression of someone embracing their destiny, but the hopeful uncertainty of a 17-year-old girl trying to understand where she belonged. What did you tell her? I told her blood was more important than sentiment. That family loyalty mattered more than suburban fairy tales. Isabella's voice cracked slightly, but she looked disappointed, like I'd given her the wrong answer. Elena turned back to face Isabella, and for the first time since the girl had walked through her door, she saw past the manufactured confidence to the truth underneath. Isabella wasn't Griselda's perfect weapon. She was another granddaughter trying to earn love from a woman who dealt only in power and fear. How old were you when Griselda found you? 12, after my mother died. Isabella's mask slipped completely now, revealing the lost child she'd never been allowed to be. I thought she was rescuing me. She gave me everything, education, protection, purpose. But she never gave you a choice. Isabella's silence was answer enough. Elena could see the girl's entire history written in the careful way she held herself, trained from childhood to be grateful for belonging to something larger than herself, taught to mistake control for love, conditioned to believe that family meant obligation rather than acceptance. Sophia has something you never had, Elena said gently. She knows what it feels like to be loved without conditions. That's not weakness, Isabella. That's strength. And it's going to make her impossible for Griselda to control. The phone in Elena's pocket buzzed with another text message, but neither woman moved to check it. The storm was intensifying outside, and Elena could feel the weight of decisions that could no longer be avoided pressing down on both of them. When Isabella finally spoke, her voice carried the tremor of someone whose carefully constructed world was beginning to crack. What if you're wrong? What if blood really does win? Elena smiled, and for the first time in 17 years, it held no trace of Margaret Castellanos's careful domesticity. Then, Griselda is about to discover that Sophia inherited more than just her financial instincts. She inherited her great-grandmother's talent for protective deception. The emotional point of no return had arrived, and Elena could feel the ghost of who she used to be stirring in her chest, preparing for war. The phone buzzed again, but this time Elena recognized the number. Sophia's cell phone. She answered without hesitation, putting it on speaker so Isabella could hear. Abuela? Sophia's voice was different, steadier, older somehow, as if the last few hours had aged her years instead of minutes. I know you're with Isabella. I asked her to find you. Elena's chest tightened. Mija, where are you? Are you safe? I'm at the Fontainebleau Hotel, penthouse suite. Sophia paused, and Elena could hear the weight of new knowledge in the silence. With Bisabuela Griselda. She's been telling me stories about my real family, about my real grandmother. The words cut deeper than Elena had expected. 17 years of bedtime stories, scraped knees, and patient explanations about homework, erased by a few hours of blood-soaked family history. Sophia, why didn't you tell me who you really are? Sophia's voice cracked with the particular pain of teenage betrayal. Why didn't you tell me who I really am? Elena looked at Isabella, who was watching with the clinical interest of someone studying a laboratory experiment. This was the moment Griselda had orchestrated, the confrontation that would force Elena to choose between honesty and protection, between the woman she'd been and the woman she'd pretended to become. Because I wanted you to have choices I never had, Elena said quietly. Because I wanted you to choose kindness because it felt right, not because someone told you to. Because I wanted you to be Sofia Castellanos, who writes poetry and helps strangers, instead of Sofia Blanco, who inherits blood debts. Isabella's expression shifted, something vulnerable flickering behind her carefully constructed armor. She'd never heard anyone explain family love in terms of freedom instead of obligation. Sophia's laugh was bitter, too old for her 17 years. But I am Sofia Blanco. The money proved that tonight. I moved $3 million like it was nothing, Abuela, like I'd been doing it my whole life. Bisabuela says it's in my blood. Your blood didn't move that money, mija. Your heart did, because you thought I was dying and you'd do anything to save me. Elena's voice hardened with 17 years of suppressed truth. That's not Blanco instinct. That's love, and that's something your bisabuela stopped understanding decades ago. She's here, Sophia said suddenly, her voice dropping to a whisper. She wants to talk to you. The phone rustled as it changed hands, and then Griselda's voice filled Elena's living room like smoke from an old fire. My beautiful Elena. Still trying to rewrite history, I see. Elena straightened, feeling the Margaret Castellanos mask finally slip away completely. Hello, Griselda. You look exactly the same too, still stealing children and calling it family. Isabella stepped backward, eyes widening. She'd never heard anyone speak to Griselda Blanco with casual contempt. I don't steal children, mi amor. I claim what's already mine. Sofia belongs with her real family, learning her real heritage. Not hidden away in some suburban fantasy pretending she's ordinary. Sofia belongs wherever she chooses to be. That's the difference between us. I raised her to choose. You raised Isabella to obey. The silence stretched between them, filled with decades of unresolved history. When Griselda spoke again, her voice carried the cold satisfaction of someone playing their final card. Very well. Let Sofia choose. But let her choose with complete information. A pause that felt like the moment before lightning strikes. Tell her about the night her grandfather died, Elena. Tell her why you really ran. Elena's blood turned to ice. Isabella was staring at her with new interest, sensing secrets even deeper than the ones already revealed. Tell her, Griselda continued, her voice soft as silk over steel, about the $500,000 David stole from my accounts. Tell her about the federal wiretap he was planning to trigger. Tell her about the warehouse where he was meeting with DEA agents when my people found him. Elena closed her eyes, seeing David's face the night she'd discovered his betrayal. Not the gentle literature professor Sophia remembered from stories, but a desperate man trying to buy his family's safety with information that would have destroyed everyone Elena had ever protected. Tell her, Griselda whispered, about why you put the bullet in his head yourself. Isabella gasped, her perfect composure finally shattering completely. Even she hadn't known this part of the story. But Elena opened her eyes and smiled, the same smile that had once convinced federal agents that she was just a grieving widow who knew nothing about her husband's business dealings. You want complete information? Elena said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd outplayed better criminals than Griselda. Then tell Sophia why David was really meeting with the DEA. Tell her about the leverage they offered him. The silence from the phone stretched like a held breath. Tell her about the cancer diagnosis you gave him, Griselda. Tell her how you used his fear for his family to turn him into an informant. Tell her that everything he did because you made him believe his daughter would die without your protection. The line went dead. Elena looked at Isabella, who was staring at her with something approaching awe. Now, Elena said quietly, you understand why blood doesn't always win. The storm had passed by the time Sophia returned 3 hours later, leaving Coral Gables washed clean under a sky full of stars. Elena heard the car door slam in her driveway and felt her heart complete a rhythm it had been missing since this began. Isabella had left an hour earlier, walking out into the rain without a word, but not before she'd given Elena a phone number written on expensive stationery. For when Sophia needs family who understands both worlds, she'd said quietly. The girl was learning that blood didn't have to mean bondage. Sophia appeared in the doorway looking exhausted, and somehow both younger and older than when Elena had last seen her. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders, and she wore one of Elena's old cardigans over her dress, the blue one with small pearl buttons that Elena had been saving for special occasions. I took this from your closet, Sophia said, touching the cardigan's sleeve. I hope that's okay. Everything at the hotel smelled like expensive perfume and secrets. Elena opened her arms, and Sophia fell into them like she had as a child after nightmares. They held each other in the doorway while the last drops of rain fell from the gutters, washing 17 years of careful lies down into the storm drains. She showed me pictures, Sophia whispered against Elena's shoulder, of you when you were young. You looked so fierce, Abuela, so powerful. Why did you give that up? Elena stroked Sophia's hair, feeling the weight of every choice that had brought them to this moment. I didn't give it up, mija. I transformed it. All that fierceness, all that power, I poured it into loving you instead of controlling empires. It was the best investment I ever made. Sophia pulled back to study Elena's face, searching for deception out of habit now. She said you killed my grandfather, said you chose loyalty over love. I chose you over everything else. Your grandfather was going to destroy himself and take our family with him out of fear. I stopped him the only way I knew how. Elena's voice carried no shame, only the quiet certainty of someone who'd made peace with necessary choices. But I've regretted that he never got to see who you became. He would have been so proud. They moved into the kitchen, where Elena put on tea, and Sophia sat at the small table where she'd done homework for years. The domestic ritual felt surreal after everything that had happened, but also essential, proof that love lived in ordinary moments as much as dramatic revelations. The money's gone, Sophia said, watching steam rise from her mug. Griselda kept it, said it was tuition for my education and family loyalty. Good. Blood money never bought anything worth having. Sophia's smile was tentative but real. I restructured her entire financial network while she was talking. Embedded some interesting protocols in the routing systems. If she tries to access the accounts, well, she shrugged with studied innocence. Let's say the federal authorities might receive some automated reports about suspicious activity. Elena stared at her granddaughter with growing amazement. You sabotaged Griselda Blanco's money laundering operation while sitting in her living room? You taught me that protection sometimes requires a fence. Sophia's grin was pure mischief wrapped around steel determination. Besides, someone should pay for threatening my abuela, even if that someone is technically family. Elena laughed, truly laughed, for the first time in weeks. Sophia hadn't chosen Griselda's world or Elena's careful disguises. She'd chosen her own path, one that honored both her inheritance and her principles. What happens now? Sophia asked, suddenly serious again. Do we run? Change names again? Pretend tonight never happened? Elena looked around her kitchen, seeing 17 years of accumulated life. Sophia's height marks on the doorframe, finger paintings still held to the refrigerator by magnets, the chipped mug Sophia had made in pottery class that Elena treasured above fine china. Margaret Castellanos had been a beautiful fiction, but this house had become genuinely home. No more running, Elena said finally. No more pretending. We stay here, in our life, but we stay awake, we stay ready. And we remember that family is what you choose to protect, not what chooses to own you. Sophia nodded, understanding flowing between them without need for words. They would keep their quiet life, but they would keep it with open eyes. Elena would teach her granddaughter about financial networks and protective deception alongside literature and kindness. They would be prepared for whatever came next. Outside, Coral Gables settled into peaceful sleep under stars that had witnessed everything and judged nothing. Inside, two women who had discovered they were stronger together than either bloodline or solitude had ever made them, sat drinking tea and planning a future that belonged entirely to them. The story people would tell about the night Griselda Blanco lost $3 million would focus on theft and revenge. But Elena knew the real story was simpler and more profound. Love had learned to fight back, and family had remembered how to choose itself.